He was the most feared man in Seoul. A cold, calculating, untouchable. A man who had built an empire on silence and steel, who trusted no one and needed nothing. But on a rain-soaked mountain road on the outskirts of the city, his own blood decided he had lived long enough. What happened next? The woman who found him, the life she gave him, and the truth that detonated in the middle of a ballroom full of thieves is a story nobody saw coming. Especially him. Let's begin. The rain came down in sheets over Seoul that Thursday night. The kind of rain that turned the Han River silver and made the city's towers look like they were dissolving at their edges. Inside a private lounge on the 42nd floor of a building that belonged, technically, to the man they were plotting against, Jae-sung Park stood at the window with a glass of scotch in his hand and the particular stillness of a man who had been waiting a very long time for this moment. He was lean and angular, with the restless energy of someone who had spent years performing patience he didn't feel. His black turtleneck absorbed the dim light of the room. His jaw was sharp, his eyes quick, and tonight those eyes carried a glitter that had nothing to do with the whiskey. Beside him, his sister Soo-yeon Park sat in a high-backed chair with her legs crossed and her black blazer buttoned, as though she were about to present quarterly earnings to a board of directors. In a way, she was. "It's done," Jae-sung said. He didn't say it loudly. In the quiet of their shared purpose, a murmur was enough. He thought of the mechanic. A careful man, well compensated, who understood exactly how to make a brake line look like it had simply surrendered to the stress of a fast mountain road. The kind of failure that happened. That investigators closed files on. That nobody questioned when the driver was already at the bottom of a ravine. Soo-yeon didn't smile right away. She smoothed the lapel of her blazer with one finger, her gaze somewhere past the window, already 3 steps into the legal architecture of what came next. "Hyun-jae is meticulous," she said, her voice the texture of polished stone. "If he senses anything before he reaches the pass, we lose everything." She looked at her brother, her expression precise and still. "He has always believed we were lesser, because we are steps. Tonight we prove that lesser blood can still end a dynasty." Across the city, in a penthouse that occupied the entire 58th floor of Kim Tower, Hyun-jae Kim was buttoning the cuffs of a navy suit that had been made for him by a tailor in Milan. He did this the way he did everything, without ceremony, without hurry, with the focused efficiency of a man who viewed time as the only currency that couldn't be recovered. He checked his reflection briefly, not out of vanity but out of habit, the way a soldier checks his equipment before deployment. His face was all hard lines and quiet authority, a jaw carved from something unforgiving, eyes so dark and focused they had a tendency to make people feel that he already knew what they were about to say before they said it. He was 38 years old, and he had been running the Kim conglomerate, legitimate on paper, considerably less so beneath, since his father's death 6 years ago. He had not taken a vacation. He had not taken a partner. He had not, in 6 years, allowed himself to need anything he couldn't provide himself. He picked up his car keys and glanced at a framed photograph on the side table. His father, 10 years younger than Hyun-jae was now, standing in front of a building that no longer existed. The weight of everything that photograph represented settled across his shoulders the way it always did. Heavy. Familiar. His. He didn't know that the car in the garage below had been converted, quietly and expertly, into the last place he would ever sit. He didn't know that 2 floors above where his step-siblings had stood 3 hours earlier, the glasses had already been raised. To the inheritance, Soo-yeon had said. Hyun-jae rode the elevator down alone, nodded to the night security guard, and pulled out into the rain. The mountain pass on Seoul's northern edge was a road that demanded respect even in dry weather. In the rain, on a November night, with no other headlights in either direction, it was a serpent of wet asphalt coiling around cliff faces that dropped away into darkness. Hyun-jae drove it the way he drove most things, fast and controlled, the engine of the G-Wagon a deep, confident hum beneath him, his hands light on the wheel. He crested the highest point of the pass and began the descent. He pressed the brake. Nothing. For one suspended second, there was only the sound of rain on glass and the particular silence of a man whose entire understanding of his own invincibility has just been revised. Then the guardrail came up at a speed that no amount of steering could address, and the world became a catastrophe of noise. Metal tearing, glass exploding inward, the sickening lurch of a vehicle that has left the road entirely, and then the ancient pines at the bottom of the ravine came up to meet him, and then there was nothing at all. The wreckage settled into silence. Steam rose from the engine in thin, white columns. Rain drummed steadily on what remained of the roof. Hyun-jae Kim, billionaire, crime boss, untouchable, lay draped over the steering wheel in a ruined navy suit, blood moving slowly from a gash above his eye, his breathing so shallow it was barely a rumor. To anyone who might have passed, no one did, not for the first 30 minutes. He was simply a body in the dark. Amara Johnson had been a nurse for 9 years and had learned, in that time, to trust the particular feeling that moved through her chest when something was wrong before she understood why. She felt it now as her headlights swept around a bend on the mountain road and caught the gap in the guardrail, the raw, jagged absence of metal that told her something had gone through it recently and at speed. She pulled over without deliberating. Amara was not a woman who deliberated when the situation was clear. She grabbed her emergency kit from the back seat and her flashlight from the glove compartment and scrambled down the embankment in the rain, her blue scrubs soaking through before she reached the bottom. The car below was barely recognizable as a car. It had folded itself around a cluster of pines with a completeness that made her stomach drop. She pushed through the wet undergrowth to the driver's side, clicked on her flashlight. The beam found his face. Even unconscious, even wrecked, there was something in the structure of that face that communicated a life lived at a different altitude than most. High cheekbones. A jaw set hard, even in unconsciousness. Dark hair matted against a forehead wound that was bleeding freely. She pushed the observation aside and reached through the shattered window with gloved hands, pressing 2 fingers to the side of his neck. Nothing. Nothing. Then there. A pulse so faint it was barely distinguishable from her own wishful thinking, but it was there, a thread of life refusing to snap. "Stay with me," she said quietly. She said it to unconscious patients sometimes, not because she thought they could hear her, but because the instruction helped her too. "Stay with me. Focus. Work." She worked quickly and with the efficient calm of someone who had done difficult things in difficult conditions many times before. No identification anywhere visible. No phone. No wallet. Just a man in an expensive ruined suit at the bottom of a ravine, alive by a margin that was shrinking. She knew she couldn't wait for an ambulance. The location, the rain, his vitals, the math was simple, and the answer was bad. She had to move him now. She had to take him herself. It took everything she had. He was tall, solidly built, dead weight in the most literal sense of the phrase, and the embankment was mud and wet grass and nothing to grip. She talked to him the whole time, low and steady, the way she talked to patients in the ICU who may or may not have been listening. She got him to her car. She got him into the back seat. She covered him with a thermal blanket she kept behind the passenger seat, and she looked at his face in the interior light for 1 moment before she climbed in front. There was something about him she couldn't name. Not beauty exactly, though his features were striking. Something more like the ghost of a presence, the residue of a man who had, until recently, occupied a great deal of space in the world. It clung to him even now, unconscious and bleeding, the way expensive cologne lingered in a room after the wearer had left. She didn't take him to the hospital. She thought about it for the first 2 miles, and then she thought about the absence of any identification, the condition of the road, the deliberate quality of that guardrail gap, and something in her nursing instinct told her that a public hospital, with its records and its questions, was not where this man needed to be right now. She didn't know why she was certain of this. She was certain of it. She took him home. The guest room in Amara's apartment on the 3rd floor of a building in Mapogu was small and clean and smelled of lavender from the diffuser she kept on the windowsill. She had set up the spare bed properly, had run a line, and managed his most critical needs with the supplies she kept at home, out of the occupational habit of a woman who preferred to be prepared. By the time she finally sat back in the wooden chair beside the bed and let herself breathe, It was past 3 in the morning. She watched him sleep. The bandage across his forehead was clean and white against his dark hair. His breathing had deepened and steadied. His color, which had been a terrifying gray when she found him, had moved back towards something that looked like alive. She had no idea who he was. She only knew that he was alive because she had been on that road at that hour, and that whatever had put him at the bottom of that ravine had not finished the job, and that this, for now, was enough. When he opened his eyes the next morning, the authority that must have lived in them ordinarily was entirely absent. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment with a blank, searching quality of someone flipping through a book and finding all the pages empty. Then he turned his head and found her. "You're awake," Amara said. He looked at her the way people looked at things they were trying to place, not with recognition, but with the effortful attention of someone reaching for a context that wasn't there. "Where?" His voice was barely sound. He tried to sit up, and his face contracted sharply with pain. "Don't." She was beside him immediately, one hand firm and gentle on his shoulder. "You have a significant head injury and 3 cracked ribs. You're not going anywhere quickly." She watched his eyes. "You're safe. I'm Amara. I'm a nurse. I found you last night at the bottom of a ravine off the mountain pass. I brought you here." He looked at her for a long moment. "Who am I?" he asked. The question was so quiet and so complete that it took her a moment to understand it wasn't rhetorical. "I don't know," she said honestly. There was no identification at the site. No phone, no wallet. "I don't know your name." Something moved through his eyes. Not panic, but a particular kind of vertigo, the look of a man standing in a room he doesn't recognize, searching for a door. "I can't," he stopped. His brow furrowed with the physical effort of trying to reach something that wasn't there. "There's nothing. It's like it's all been taken." Amara reached out and covered his hand with hers. His knuckles were bruised, his skin pale against her own deep brown. "Don't force it. Head trauma works that way sometimes. Memory is cautious. It comes back on its own terms, not yours." She gave his hand a brief, steady pressure. "For now, you have a place to stay, and someone to look after you. That's enough." He looked down at their hands. In his blank, untethered state, the touch was the most real thing he had. He didn't know that in another life, a life he couldn't currently access, he would have categorized such a moment as a liability. He only knew that her hand was warm and that the room smelled of lavender, and that both of these things made the terror slightly smaller. "Why would you do this?" he asked. "For a stranger, who is nothing." Amara gave him the small, unhurried smile that her patients had been receiving from her for 9 years, the one that meant, "This is a simple question with a simple answer. Because you were hurt, and I could help. That's the whole reason." She called him Jay for simplicity, the only syllable that had surfaced once in his first day of fitful consciousness, emerging from his lips while he was still half asleep, clinging to something just below the surface. He didn't correct her, because he had nothing to correct it with. The days organized themselves around his recovery and her shifts. Amara moved through the apartment with a slim, quiet efficiency, her scrubs exchanged for oversized sweaters in the evenings, the stethoscope migrating from her neck to her bag to the table by the door with the rhythm of her comings and goings. She cooked simple meals and checked his vitals twice daily and talked to him in the easy, unhurried way of someone who was comfortable with silence, but didn't require it. He watched her the way a man watched the only thing in a dark room that produced light. She taught him things without intending to. How to wait for tea to cool rather than drinking it scalding, because patience produced a better result. How to stand on the small balcony in the morning with a cup in both hands and simply be inside the moment rather than planning the next one. She had 3 plants on that balcony, a stubborn orchid, a small succulent, and a pot of herbs she used in cooking, and she tended them with a matter-of-fact care that he found inexplicably moving. One afternoon she handed him a knife and asked him to slice onions. He held the knife with the instinctive competence of someone who had some relationship with blades, but fumbled completely with a vegetable, and Amara laughed, a genuine, uncalculated sound that filled the small kitchen with something that felt, to the nameless man who had forgotten everything, like warmth. "You hold it like it owes you something," she said, repositioning his grip with both hands. It's an onion. Be easy with it. He was not accustomed to being corrected. He was not accustomed to kitchens or laughter, or the particular domesticity of standing beside someone while something cooked. He had no access to these facts about himself, but his body knew them. The smallness of this life registered as extraordinary. One evening they sat together on the sofa, the television on at low volume, Amara reading through a medical journal with her legs tucked under her, her stethoscope draped over the armrest. He had been watching her for several minutes in the way he always watched her, thoroughly, without pretense. "Why did you stay that night?" he asked. "You could have called emergency services and kept driving."
You didn't know me.
She put the journal down and looked at him with the directness she brought to everything. "I'm a nurse. Seeing the person rather than the situation is the whole job." A pause. "And you looked like someone who had been carrying something enormous for a very long time. Alone. I couldn't drive past that." Something tightened in his chest. He reached out, slowly, and covered her hand with his. She didn't pull away. "I don't know who I was before," he said quietly. "But I know I'm better at being whoever this is when you're in the room." Amara looked at their hands, then at his face, and the warmth in her expression deepened into something more considered. "Maybe the accident wasn't only a tragedy," she said. "Maybe it was also a door." He looked at her in the soft lamplight of her small apartment, this woman who had pulled him from a wreck and asked for nothing, and felt something shift in the place where his identity used to be. He didn't have the language for it yet. He only knew it was real in a way that nothing else in his current existence was. He didn't know that across the city, in his own penthouse, his step-siblings were sleeping in his bed and drinking from his cellar and signing documents in his name. He didn't know that search teams had swept the ravine twice and closed the file. He didn't know that the digital displays in his building's lobby no longer showed his name. He only knew the lavender and the orchid on the balcony and the woman beside him who had chosen to stop. The peace didn't shatter dramatically. It was broken by a name, spoken by a news anchor in the measured tones of a business report, drifting out of the television on an otherwise quiet Saturday evening. Amara was in the kitchen. Jay was on the sofa. The anchor was discussing the confirmed leadership transition at Kim International, and behind her on the screen, standing at a podium with a practiced expression of solemn responsibility, was Jae-sung Park in a charcoal suit. Beside him stood Soo-yeon, black blazer, perfect posture, a smile that was doing its best to look like grief. Jae-sung Park, the anchor said, has been formally appointed chairman following the tragic death of Hyun-jae Kim in a mountain road accident last month. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Hyun-jae Kim. The man on the sofa went completely still. The tea towel he had been folding dropped to the floor. On the screen, Jae-sung was speaking into the microphone, his voice carrying the practiced tremor of a man performing sorrow for an audience he'd already decided didn't matter. His eyes, however, were doing something else entirely. They were lit with the particular brightness of someone who had gotten away with something enormous and hadn't yet gotten tired of knowing it. Something in the back of Hyun-jae's skull began to crack open. It didn't come gently. It came the way suppressed things came when the dam finally went. All at once, in no particular order, with a force that had been building for weeks behind the wall of the amnesia. The smell of Cuban cigars in a wood-paneled study. The weight of a specific gold watch. The sound of his own voice giving an instruction in a boardroom. The feeling of a car key in his hand. The mountain road. The pedal that gave way. The last conscious image of Jae-sung's face, not as it appeared on television right now, arranged in calculated grief, but as it had appeared 3 nights before the accident, at a dinner table, his eyes glittering with something that Hyun-jae had registered and dismissed as arrogance. He hadn't dismissed it far enough. Soo-yeon's voice came back to him as clearly as if she were in the room. "He thinks our blood is diluted. Tonight we prove that diluted blood can still end a dynasty." Hyun-jae's hands, resting on his thighs, curled slowly into fists. "Jae." Amara was in front of him, her hands on his shoulders, her face close and intent. She had appeared at some point during the unraveling, and he hadn't registered her arrival. Look at me. Look at me. He looked at her. The vacant softness that had lived in his eyes for weeks was gone. What replaced it was something she had not seen before, a clarity so complete and so cold it was like looking through glass into deep water. The man who had fumbled with an onion 3 days ago was not present anymore. The man looking at her now was someone else entirely, and she felt the difference the way you felt a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm.
I remember, he said. His voice had changed.
It was no longer the careful, searching tone of a man feeling his way through darkness. It was low and certain and had an edge to it that made the small apartment feel suddenly insufficient as a container. I remember everything. Amara sat down across from him. She had already been watching the television. She already knew the name they had just spoken. She had already done the arithmetic. You're him, she said quietly. Hyun-jae Kim. I'm him. He said it not as confirmation but as a reclamation. The name settling back onto him like armor. He stood. The physical transformation was immediate and complete, the slight vulnerability of posture that had accumulated over weeks of recovery snapping back into something that occupied space differently, that moved with a precision and authority that had nothing to do with the room it was currently in. He walked to the window and looked out at Seoul, and Amara watched his face and understood that she was watching a man remember what he was. They cut the brake line, he said. Not a question. Your own siblings. My step-siblings. The distinction was not affection. It was precision. They've been planning it for years. I knew they resented the inheritance structure. I knew they felt, he stopped. I should have known sooner. I should have protected against it. Amara stood. She took a breath. Hyun-jae. His name in her mouth for the first time. He turned at the sound of it. You don't have to go back to being exactly what you were before. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something move through the authority in his eyes, a crack in the stone, brief and real. He crossed the room in 3 steps and raised his hand to her face, his thumb grazing her cheekbone with a tenderness that felt like everything he wasn't going to be able to say. If I don't go back, he said, they keep what they stole. And when they eventually find out I survived, and they will, you become a liability they'll want to remove. He held her gaze. They will come for you, Amara. Not because of who you are, because of what you know, because of what you did. The realization moved through her visibly. She had not thought that far ahead. She had been living, as she always lived, one day at a time, focused on the person in front of her. She saw now that the shape of the situation was larger than she had accounted for. He dropped his hand. The mask of authority locked fully back into place. I'm not going back only for the inheritance, he said. I'm going back because the only way you are safe is if they are finished. Completely and publicly. He said it the way he made all his decisions, without drama, without asking for agreement, with the absolute certainty of a man who had already committed and was now simply explaining the logistics. Amara looked at him for a long moment. Then tell me what you need, she said. And so the lion, who had learned in a small apartment in Mapo-gu what it felt like to be simply a man, began the careful work of becoming himself again, not because he wanted to, but because the woman who had saved his life was now standing inside the blast radius of his enemies, and that was not something he was able to leave unaddressed. He had never left a betrayal unpaid. He was not going to start now. If you're watching this and you felt that, hit the like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in the world you are. Subscribe if you haven't already, and stay with me, because what happens next, the plan, the ballroom, and the moment Hyun-jae Kim walks back through the door his siblings thought they had sealed forever, that is where the story becomes something else entirely.
Don't go anywhere. Part 2.
While Hyun-jae Kim was remembering who he was, Jae-sung and Soo-yeon Park were busy becoming him. The speed with which they moved through his life was almost impressive in its ruthlessness. Within 48 hours of the inheritance papers being signed, Hyun-jae's inner circle had been quietly dispersed, senior loyalists reassigned to regional offices far enough from Seoul that they'd need a flight to cause trouble, personal staff replaced with new hires who owed their positions to the Parks and not to the man whose name was still on the building. His private accounts were being redirected through the kind of legal architecture that required expensive lawyers and a complete absence of conscience. His penthouse had been redecorated at speed. Not dramatically, Soo-yeon was too strategic for drama, but enough that his presence in the rooms had been diluted, the way you might open windows in a house to clear the scent of someone who no longer lived there. Jae-sung had taken particular pleasure in the chair. The chairman's chair in the Kim International boardroom was a custom piece, high-backed, dark leather, positioned at the head of an obsidian table in a room where the view of Seoul at night was engineered to make anyone sitting opposite feel the appropriate smallness. He settled into it on the third morning with the satisfaction of a man who had been told his whole life that certain things were not meant for him and had decided, unilaterally, that he had been misinformed. He held his morning briefings from that chair. He signed documents from that chair. He toasted to himself from that chair, a glass of Hyun-jae's private label scotch in hand, looking out at the city his stepbrother had built and deciding that it looked considerably better from this angle. Soo-yeon let him have the performance. She was busy with the substance. She worked with the cold, methodical focus of someone who had been planning this moment for years and was not about to waste it on sentiment. She restructured the conglomerate's charitable holdings, which were largely tax vehicles anyway, and redirected the capital into assets that were harder to trace and easier to move. She negotiated 3 new contracts with overseas partners who had been waiting for a leadership change at Kim International because Hyun-jae's ethics, such as they were, had made certain arrangements impossible. She updated the corporate communications. She changed the security protocols. She was very good at what she did. She had always been the more dangerous of the two, the one whose intelligence didn't announce itself until it was too late to prepare for it. Hyun-jae had known this. He had managed it by keeping them close but inconsequential. He had not, in the end, managed it well enough. What neither sibling knew, what they couldn't know, because they had been too certain of his death to leave room for any other scenario, was that 30 kilometers away, in a third-floor apartment in Mapogu, the man they had buried in a financial report was sitting at a kitchen table under a single amber lamp, drawing a floor plan from memory on the back of a piece of paper, the lamplight catching the hard lines of his jaw and the scar above his eyebrow that had not yet finished healing. He had been awake for most of the night. Amara sat across from him with her arms folded on the table, her medical bag open at her elbow, out of habit rather than necessity. She had been awake too. The Kim International Executive Gala is in 6 days, Hyun-jae said. His voice had settled back into its register, low, even, carrying the particular density of someone accustomed to rooms listening when he spoke. It was scheduled before the accident. Jae-sung will use it as the official coronation. New chairman, new era, all the appropriate theater. He paused, his pen moving across the paper. They will have doubled private security. They will expect a challenge from rival organizations, anyone who sees instability at the top of the Kim structure as an opportunity. They will not expect a ghost. Amara looked at the floor plan taking shape under his hands. The Grand Mairi Plaza, she recognized it, an event venue in Gangnam she had passed 100 times without ever having reason to enter. "What do you need from me?" He looked up. The question didn't surprise him. This was what she had said 2 days ago when he told her what was coming, and she had said it the same way then. Not with hesitation, not with conditions, with the directness of a woman assessing a situation and making a practical decision about it. It was one of the things about her that had become, over the weeks of his recovery, completely indispensable. "The gala will have a contracted medical standby team," he said. "Small, 3 or 4 nurses and a paramedic stationed at the service entrance on the north side. They'll have clearance to the service corridors, the kitchen level, and the first 3 floors. He set the pen down. "Your hospital credentials are legitimate. Your face is not in any system connected to me. You are exactly the kind of person who moves through secured spaces without anyone looking at you twice." "Invisible," Amara said. "Effective," he corrected. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite apology, but the acknowledgement of a man who understood what he was asking and wasn't comfortable with it. "There is something I need from the building. A hardware key, a biometric bypass device I had installed in the plaza's secure deposit facility 18 months ago. It gives me backdoor access to Kim International's internal servers. Evidence. Account records. Security footage. Everything." His eyes held hers. "With that, I don't need a confrontation. I have everything the police and every major news outlet in this country will need to finish this for me. Amara was quiet for a moment. And if they recognize me, if someone makes the connection, they won't be looking for a nurse. He paused. But if something goes wrong, if anything feels wrong, you leave. Immediately, without hesitation. Whatever happens to the plan, you're not part of the collateral. She looked at him steadily. You know, I pulled a man twice my size out of a ravine in the dark and the rain. I'm not particularly easy to intimidate. Something moved through his eyes. It happened sometimes. A crack in the authority. A moment where the man who had learned to chop onions and water orchids looked out through the face of the crime boss, and the combination of the two was almost unbearable. I know, he said quietly, which is the only reason I'm asking. In the days between the plan and the gala, Hyun-jae made contact with the loyalists his siblings had not been able to reach. There were 3 of them, men who had served him long enough to have developed the kind of discretion that didn't expire when the paychecks changed hands. He met each of them separately, in different locations, always moving and never staying. He moved through Seoul like a man who had grown up in its shadows, which he had. He kept coming back to Amara's apartment. There was nowhere else, practically speaking, and that was the explanation he gave himself on the first night he returned. By the 3rd night, he had stopped offering himself explanations and simply came back because it was where he needed to be, which had become, without his fully cataloging the progression, the same place she was. She was home when he returned each time. She had dinner ready not because he had asked but because she had calculated, accurately, when he would arrive. They ate together at the small table with the lamp on and the city outside the window, and very little conversation, because neither of them needed to fill the silence, and both of them understood that what was happening between them existed, for now, in the space that silence made room for. He watched her read before she slept, the medical journal open in her lap, her handwriting in the margins of articles she disagreed with. He watched her check on the orchid on the balcony each morning with a focus that she never quite explained and he never quite asked about. He watched her and felt, with increasing clarity, that the man who had lived in the Kim Tower penthouse for 6 years and never once sat at a kitchen table with a person he trusted had not been fully alive. He didn't say this.
There was no room for it yet.
But he kept it. The night before the gala, he found her standing at the balcony door in the dark, looking out at the city. He came to stand beside her. The Seoul skyline glittered in the cold November air, and somewhere in the middle distance the upper floors of Kim Tower caught the light and threw it back. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she confirmed. He turned to look at her profile, the soft curve of her face in the ambient light from the city below. When this is finished, he said, I want you to know that what you gave me, the weeks here, the way you treated a man who had nothing as if he were worth something, I won't forget it. Whatever comes after tomorrow, I won't forget it. Amara looked at him. Whatever comes after tomorrow, she said carefully, I hope it includes dinner. At a proper table. Not a gala, not a plan, just dinner. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, the sternness around his mouth softened. Yes, he said. She went to bed. He stayed at the window for a while longer, looking at his city, thinking about the morning. The Grand Mairie Plaza on the evening of the Kim International Gala was everything Jae-sung had wanted it to be. Vast, brilliant, designed to communicate that a new era had arrived and intended to be taken seriously. The chandeliers were the kind that made even ordinary faces look significant. The flowers were architectural. The guest list represented the entirety of Seoul's business and political elite, every one of them there to assess the new order, to decide how they felt about it, and to be seen deciding. Jae-sung moved through the room in a tuxedo that had been made in 48 hours by Hyun-jae's own tailor, a detail he found privately satisfying. He shook hands with the confidence of a man who believed the narrative had been fully written, and all that remained was the reading of it aloud. Beside him, Soo-yeon worked the room with her usual surgical elegance, placing the right word with the right person at the right moment, her black gown a deliberate echo of authority. They had toasted once already, privately, in the anteroom before the guests arrived. To the future, Jae-sung had said. To everything we built, Soo-yeon had replied, which was her version of the same thing. Neither of them noticed the nurse who had arrived with the medical standby team at 6:47 p.m. through the North Service entrance. Neither of them saw the woman in blue scrubs who moved through the service corridors with the unhurried purposefulness of someone performing a routine job, her credentials checked at 2 security points without incident, her face attracting no particular attention in a building full of people whose attention was pointed elsewhere. Amara found the secure deposit room on the lower service level 17 minutes after entering the building. She used the access code Hyun-jae had given her, memorized, never written down, and retrieved the small hardware device from the box without incident. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. 9 years of working in emergency medicine had produced in her a capacity for calm under pressure that had nothing to do with the absence of fear and everything to do with having learned, early and thoroughly, that fear and function were not mutually exclusive. She found the signal relay point he had specified, a maintenance alcove on the second floor where the building's internal network had a specific vulnerability, identified and cataloged by the man who had helped design the building's security 18 months ago, and connected the device. She messaged a single word to the number Hyun-jae had given her.
Done.
In a car parked 2 blocks from the plaza service entrance, Hyun-jae watched the upload bar on his laptop move from 0 to 100% with the focused patience of a man who had learned, in the last 6 weeks, what patience actually felt like. When it completed, he closed the laptop, straightened his jacket, and stepped out of the car. He had dressed carefully. A charcoal suit, not navy. He was not arriving as the man who had left. A white shirt, no tie. The scar above his eyebrow had healed to a thin, pale line that was visible without being dramatic. He looked like a man who had survived something significant and was no longer particularly interested in pretending otherwise. His 3 loyalists fell into position around him as he crossed the street toward the plaza's main entrance. The front doors of the Grand Mairie Plaza opened at the signal of the lead security officer, who had been one of Hyun-jae's men for 4 years and had been waiting for this particular signal for 6 weeks with the specific, compressed patience of someone who knows they are on the right side of something and simply needs the clock to run down. Hyun-jae walked in. He paused just inside the main doors and looked across the ballroom. He took in the chandeliers, the flowers, the board members and politicians and business partners arranged across the floor in their conversations, and then he found Jae-sung at the center of it all, glass raised, performing the role with the energy of someone who had wanted it for a long time and was still not quite accustomed to believing he had it. Then Hyun-jae walked toward the stage. He didn't hurry. He never hurried. The crowd registered him in the way crowds registered sudden anomalies. First one person, then the person beside them, then the widening ring of turned heads and arrested conversations that preceded the understanding of what they were looking at. By the time he reached the first row of tables, the room had gone quiet enough that his footsteps were audible. He reached the front and looked up at the stage. On the screen behind the podium, in high definition and with synchronized audio from 2 different recording sources, the footage Amara had retrieved from a server was now playing. The maintenance garage. The sound of a brake line being cut. The voice of a mechanic confirming the specifications. And then, overlaid, a recording from Soo-yeon's private office, a conversation about timing, about the mountain road, about what the search teams would and wouldn't find. Evidence so complete and so clean that it had the quality of a closing argument. Jae-sung's champagne glass slipped from his hand and detonated against the marble floor. Soo-yeon's composure, which was exceptional and had been tested many times, failed completely for the first time in her adult life. She went the color of old paper. The dead, Hyun-jae said, loud enough for the entire room. Don't always stay where you put them. He stepped onto the stage. The room was completely, totally silent, the particular silence of several hundred people recalibrating simultaneously. He looked at his step-siblings with a cold, absolute focus of a man who has been patient about something for precisely as long as the situation required, and is now finished being patient. You calculated correctly, he said to Soo-yeon, because she was the one worth addressing. The road, the speed, the guardrail. You were thorough. He paused. You didn't calculate the nurse. He turned his head toward the side entrance. Amara walked in. She had changed. The blue scrubs were gone, replaced by a floor-length emerald dress that she wore with the same straightforward composure she brought to everything, not performing the occasion, simply present in it. Her hair was natural, framing her face in the warm light of the chandeliers, and she walked across the ballroom floor with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had decided where she was going and saw no reason to make a production of it. She reached Hyun-jae's side, and her hand found his. He held it. "This is Amara Johnson," he said, to the room and to his siblings and to the cameras he knew were recording. She found a man at the bottom of a ravine and chose to save him rather than leave him. She asked for nothing. She expected nothing. His eyes moved to Jae-sung and Soo-yeon. You found a brother and chose to kill him rather than share with him. The distance between those two choices is the distance between everything you are and everything she is. Soo-yeon moved, some reflex, some calculation about exits or leverage, and found that the security staff had rearranged itself while nobody was watching the security staff. 2 of Hyun-jae's loyalists were already at the stage flanks. The doors had been covered. "The police have the evidence," Hyun-jae said. "Every news organization with a business desk in this country has the evidence. The embezzlement records, the account transfers, the footage." He looked at his step-siblings without particular heat in his voice. There was something colder than heat in it, the flat finality of a verdict being read. "You didn't lose the inheritance tonight. You lost your freedom. Whatever comes next is the consequence of the choice you made on a mountain road last month." He didn't watch them be escorted out. He turned away from it. He turned to Amara. The ballroom was still full of people and noise and the particular electric charge of something historic having just occurred, but in the small space between them it was quiet, the way it was quiet in her apartment when they sat at the kitchen table after dinner, the city outside and both of them inside, and nothing requiring explanation. He looked at her face. The scar above his eyebrow caught the chandelier light. She looked back at him with the same directness she had turned on him the first morning he'd opened his eyes in her guest room, when he'd been a nameless wreck of a man and she had been the steadiest thing in the room. She was still the steadiest thing in the room. "Dinner," he said quietly. "You mentioned dinner." A small smile moved across her face. "I did. Tomorrow." "Tomorrow," she agreed. Around them, the ballroom began to breathe again, the hum of voices, the movement of people, the reformed rhythm of a room recalibrating after a seismic event. Cameras flashed. Conversations erupted. The business of the aftermath began. Hyun-jae Kim, who was going to be at the center of all of it for months, stood still in the middle of it and looked at the woman who had stopped her car on a mountain road and scrambled down a dark embankment in the rain toward a wreck she didn't have to approach. He thought about the orchid on the balcony, the onion he had fumbled, the sound of her humming in the kitchen, the warmth of her palm against his bruised knuckles on that first cold morning. He thought about a man who had lived in a 58-floor penthouse for 6 years and never once felt safe, and a small apartment in Mapogu where he had felt nothing but. He had built an empire on the principle that needing people was a liability. He had been wrong. He had been wrong about a great many things. He had been spectacularly, irreversibly wrong about the value of a woman whose face was the first thing he had seen when he came back from the dead. The king had returned to his throne. But the throne had changed shape. It was smaller now and warmer, and it had room for 2 people in it, and the man sitting on it had learned, in the wreckage of his old life, that power was not power if there was no one worth coming home to. He tightened his hand around hers, and they stood together in the light, in the middle of the noise, in the beginning of whatever came next. If this story stayed with you, tap the heart and tell me in the comments, what part hit you the hardest? I want to know. Like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the people who choose to show up for you without being asked are the rarest and most valuable people on earth. Stay with us. There are more stories coming. Stay blessed and stay beautiful.